Herbert John Bennett was born in 1879. In July 1897, he married his then-pregnant girlfriend, Mary Jane Clark, a music teacher 3 years his senior, at the West Ham Registrar's Office in London, although the baby was later stillborn. He had wooed her with grand ambition, but in the end he worked as a newsagent's assistant, then a grocer's assistant at the Woolwich cooperative stores, and at one stage a sewing machine salesman. However, money seemed to be unaccounted for wherever Bennett worked. The couple then headed to Cape Town in South Africa under their new assumed name of Hood. The job situation didn't work out there and they returned to England just a few days later, but the marriage fell into difficulties, and by 1900 the couple were leading separate lives, with Mary Jane living in Glencoe Villas in Bexley Heath in Kent with their daughter Ruby. Every once in a while, Bennett would send his estranged wife a little money as he found steadier work at the Woolwich Arsenal. By this time he had made the acquaintance of a young woman, Alice Meadows, a parlour-maid. He met her family and took the young woman away for a brief holiday to Yarmouth, where they occupied separate rooms in the Crown and Anchor on 4th August. Bennett and Alice became engaged and talked of wedding plans. On the morning of Sunday 23rd September 1900, a woman's body was discovered by 14-year-old John Norton on Yarmouth's South Beach. She'd been asphyxiated, a mohair bootlace tied round her neck, and it was believed she died the day before, but police found it difficult to identify her. It was ascertained that she'd been staying in a guest house run by Mr. and Mrs. John Rudrum in the seaside town since 15th September, under the name of Mrs. Hood. On Friday 21st September, she'd received a letter postmarked Woolwich at the guest house, addressed to a Mrs. Hood. With her was her young daughter, Ruby. The police soon realised Hood was an alias. Under the direction of Detective Inspector Lingwood, they searched her room, finding a photograph, a purse containing a latchkey, which was later identified as belonging to the Bexley Heath house, the return half of a first-class train ticket out of Liverpool Street Station in London, and a gold brooch with the word "baby" inscribed on it. He found no letters or documents that would help identify her, and when he interviewed Mrs. Rudrum, the landlady of the guest house, she told him that she only knew her as Mrs. Hood, but that she wore a gold chain and a small silver watch. Both of these family heirlooms were missing. By the end of October, the dead woman still hadn't been identified, and a coroner's jury returned the verdict that the woman unknown had been murdered by a man unknown. What also puzzled police was the laundry mark on her petticoat. These marks were commonly added to clothing sent off to laundries and washhouses as an identifier, and in this particular case, the number printed was 599. Woolwich laundries were all asked to check if they'd had a garment with that number, but none had, so the article was published in the press. A laundry manageress in Bexley Heath saw the photograph and recognised it, and after looking through her own records, informed the police that it had belonged to a Mrs. Bennett. Meanwhile, in London, Bennett saw the news of the discovery in a newspaper and mentioned it to Alice and her sister in the passing, asking why it was taking the police so long to catch the killer. Soon, police came knocking at his door, and he was arrested for the murder of his wife, Mary Jane. During the arrest, he exclaimed, "Yarmouth? Why, I have never been to Yarmouth in my life." He also told them he hadn't lived with his wife since January, as he claimed he found love letters in her pocket from another man. During a search at the house, police discovered the gold chain and silver watch in Bennett's portmanteau, along with 2 pearl necklaces, 14 letters from Alice Meadows, a bunch of keys, a revolver and cartridges, a black bag, 2 wigs, 1 male, 1 female, and a false moustache. He was remanded in custody in Norwich, but his trial was moved to London. On Monday, 25th February 1901, 25-year-old Bennett's trial got underway at the Old Bailey before Lord Chief Justice Richard Webster. The Crown prosecution case was led by Mr. C.F. Gill, Mr. Poyser and Mr. Miller. Bennett was defended by Sir Edward Marshall Hall, King's Counsel, Mr. G. Thorne Drury, Mr. Forrest Fulton, and Mr. Labouchere. During his trial, he kept to his story, even though the facts spoke for themselves, especially the evidence from the laundry manageress, without whom the guilty party may never have been found. It was also fortuitous that a beach photographer, William Cousins, had been taking photographs earlier in the week when the body was discovered, and Mary Jane was seen wearing the necklace and watch. It also transpired at the trial that Bennett had gone to visit Mary Jane on 14 September at Bexley Heath, and again the following day. He then went to Yarmouth by train and stayed in the Crown and Anchor, run by publican Thomas Henry Keats, overnight. On 22nd September, Bennett was identified as being at the South Quay Distillery Public House, managed by William Thomas Borking, with a woman identified as his dead wife. Borking saw them between 9:30 and 10 o'clock that evening. 2 other witnesses, Alfred Mason and his girlfriend Blanche Smith, also saw the couple on the beach and heard the woman say, "Mercy, mercy." Shortly before midnight, Bennett returned to the Crown and Anchor, out of breath, and went to bed, then left for London the next morning. His landlady, Mrs. Pankhurst, confirmed he'd been away from his lodgings at Union Street in Woolwich on the night of 22nd September. Emma Elliston of Plumstead also told the court that when Bennett and his wife lodged with her, she had heard Bennett say during one of their quarrels that he wished she was dead. 3 days after his return, he was arranging to marry Alice Meadows and began giving her his wife's property. Robert Allen, who worked with Bennett, asked him around the 10th or 11th of October where his wife was, and said Bennett told him, "She is down home," then said, "I have no wife. I am about to be married." Even Marshall Hall, one of the most noted barristers at the time, couldn't get Bennett off, with the jury finding him guilty of murder. He was sentenced to death on Saturday, 2nd March. Placing his hands on the front of the dock, Bennett declared in a firm voice, "I say, I am not guilty, sir." Bennett was executed at Norwich Jail on the morning of Thursday 21st March 1901 at 9 o'clock, then buried within the prison grounds. Many years later, some doubt was cast on his conviction. In July 1912, another murder took place at Yarmouth under very similar circumstances, in that a bootlace was used to strangle the victim, 18-year-old Dora May Gray. Her killer was never found. As for little Ruby, she was eventually given into the care of a relative of Bennett's. Major Herbert Rose Armstrong, born 13th May 1869 at Plymouth in Devon, had been a practising solicitor in Hay-on-Wye in Herefordshire for a number of years, having been a junior partner in the firm Cheese and Armstrong, taking over the practice when the senior partner and his wife died within a day of each other in 1914. In 1921, a dispute arose with Hay's other solicitor, Oswald Norman Martin, regarding the sale of an estate. The sale was slow, and Martin wanted the issue closed, especially as Armstrong held £500 from his client. On 20th September 1921, Martin received an unexpected gift of chocolates from Armstrong, which were delivered to his house. Neither Martin nor his wife Constance were particularly keen on sweets of any kind, so had one and put the rest away. They were then brought out at a dinner party on 8th October. Only one of their guests, Dorothy Martin, his brother Gilbert's wife, had one, but the following day was violently ill. Meanwhile, with the transaction stalling, Martin's client decided to withdraw from the deal, so he informed Armstrong, who suggested the two meet to thrash it out. Armstrong invited Martin to his home, Mayfield, at nearby Cussop, on 26 October 1921, for afternoon tea. Armstrong poured Martin some tea, then handed him a buttered scone, saying, "Excuse my fingers." At around 6:30 that evening, Martin arrived at his home at Bredon Hills, Cussop, but an hour later began to feel unwell. That night he vomited, had stomach pains, diarrhoea, and his heart raced. When morning came, he was very sensitive towards the light, so Dr. Thomas Hinks was called the following day. Hearing the news, Armstrong offered to take on Martin's work to help him out while he was ill. However, suspicions soon rose. The local chemist was John Davies and was the father of Constance. He'd been made aware of Dorothy Martin's illness, and word got to him about Martin's sickness. He soon realised that he'd sold Armstrong several quantities of arsenic over the previous few months, but he'd claimed it was to be used as weed killer. Davis spoke to Dr. Hinks, who then took samples of Martin's vomit and urine and sent off the chocolates for testing at the Clinical Research Association in London. All tested positive for arsenic. With Armstrong being a prominent member of the community and a Freemason, police carried out their inquiries on the quiet. By the end of the year, however, they had enough evidence against him that they arrested him at his office in Broad Street. He was charged with attempted murder, but what now became suspicious was the death of his wife, Catherine Mary Armstrong, on 22nd February 1921. The couple had married in 1907 and had 3 children, Eleanor, Margaret and Pearson. She had tended to be a sickly woman, but in May 1920 she began suffering from a gastric illness, and she made out a new will on 8th July. In her previous will of 1917, she'd left everything to her 3 children, apart from £50, which her husband was to receive annually until 1933, then no more. In this new will, he was the sole beneficiary of her estate, and he was appointed as her executor. Probate was granted on 30th March 1921. It soon transpired the handwriting on this second will was Armstrong's, but his wife had signed it. Following a stint in the Barnwood Hospital for Mental Disorders near Gloucester, where she was given a tiny dose of arsenic to treat her heart murmur, confusion and delusions for a few months, she was finally released into the care of her husband and a nurse on 22nd January 1921. Just a few days later, the nurse Muriel Kinsey resigned her post due to Catherine's constant threats of suicide. Another nurse, Eva Allen, took over on 27th January. In the weeks leading up to her death, she suffered attacks of vomiting, muscular spasms and stomach pains before finally dying on 22nd February, aged 47. Her cause of death was given as primarily heart disease, but also nephritis and acute gastritis. Instead of grieving his wife's death, Armstrong took a holiday abroad, then on his return proposed to Mrs. Marion Gale, whom he'd met in 1915 while stationed in Bournemouth during World War I. When arrested, Armstrong was searched, and 1/20th of an ounce of arsenic was found in his jacket pocket. More was found in his desk drawers, and his excuse for killing weeds simply didn't wash. On 2nd January 1922, Catherine's body was exhumed, with Sir Bernard Spilsbury conducting the post-mortem. 3 3/4 grains of arsenic were found in her organs, so on 19th January 1922, Armstrong was formally charged with her murder. He appeared before Magistrate W. Mortimer Bayliss, and witnesses testified to the deteriorating health of Catherine. One woman caused a bit of a stir. This was a heavily veiled lady known in the court as Mrs. X. She turned out to be Mrs. Marion Gale. Armstrong's trial for the murder of his wife and the attempted murder of Martin began on 3rd April 1922 at Hereford before Mr. Justice John Charles Darling. Sir Ernest Pollock, King's Counsel, the Attorney-General, headed up the Crown prosecution case, while Armstrong was defended by Sir Henry Curtis Bennett. There was, however, insufficient evidence that Armstrong had sent the chocolates to Martin, so that charge was dropped. Armstrong pleaded not guilty. There was some debate in the chamber whether Catherine had wanted to die or not, with Nurse Kinsey stating she was suicidal, but Nurse Allen told the court that she had asked her if she was going to die, because, she said, she had everything to live for, my children and my husband. 2 gardeners employed by the Major also testified, but neither had ever seen him use weed killer. But Mr. J did remember Armstrong showing him a patch where he had used weed killer he'd mixed himself. Dr. Hinks told the court that he'd treated both Catherine and Martin during their illnesses, and when she'd taken ill, his instinct told him she'd been poisoned, but the symptoms she showed were all consistent with natural causes. When the chemist Davies took the stand, he told the court Armstrong had signed for arsenic in the poisons register every time he purchased it, but it never occurred to him that it was an excessive amount at the time. He always bought white arsenic, but it was more usual that it was coloured with charcoal, so this was a bit of a mystery. Sergeant Worthing told the court he'd been the one to find arsenic while searching Armstrong's home, and also found a recipe for weed killer. Both he and Chief Inspector Crutchett of Scotland Yard said that Armstrong was fully cooperative throughout the searches of both his home and his office. Martin told the court about his illness and the barrage of invites to Armstrong's home for tea following his illness, which he repeatedly declined. When Dr. Spilsbury took the stand, he told the court Catherine had died of arsenic poisoning and that large quantities of it had been consumed by her in the week leading up to her death. A fatal dose had been given 24 hours before she died. He was backed up by Sir William Wilcox, the Home Office medical advisor, and John Webster, a pathological chemist for the Home Office. It was the largest amount Webster had come across in his entire career. It was also pointed out that if it was suicide, then 1, possibly 2 large doses would have been more likely than the slow, painful death she'd suffered. Armstrong's solicitor tried to convince the court that Catherine had indeed taken her own life, but before the judge had even summed up, 11 of the 12 members of the jury believed Armstrong was guilty. Judge Darling then proceeded to pass the death sentence. The attempted murder charge, he told the court, would have to wait until the next assizes. An appeal was lodged immediately, and on 11th May was heard before the Lord Chief Justice Sir Gordon Hewart and Justices Sir Horace Avery and Sir Montague Shearman. The judges threw out the appeal, and Armstrong was hanged on 31st May 1922 at Gloucester Prison. He died protesting his innocence. On the morning of 15th November 1892 at 9 o'clock, 42-year-old Dr. Thomas Neill Cream was led to the gallows at Newgate Jail in London. He'd been convicted of murder by Justice Henry Hawkins, who described him as a diabolical character. Neill or Cream had been born in Glasgow on 29th May 1850. When he was around 5 years old, his father took the family to Quebec in Canada. Following his education, he was apprenticed to a shipbuilding company, but the work didn't suit him, so he returned to his studies, entering McGill College in Montreal in the autumn of 1872. He graduated with his medical degree with merit on 31st March 1876. During his time there, he lodged with Miss Porter in Mansfield Street. He had a human skeleton in his room, which he said was for his studies, but just before he was leaving for a holiday one autumn, he placed the skeleton on his bed. 2 days after he left, fire broke out in his room. The door was broken down and the blaze extinguished. When the charred remains were found, it was thought to be Cream's. A few days later, he returned to Mansfield Street. He'd been insured, but the insurance company questioned this. However, the claim was settled via arbitration. In 1876, Cream seduced the daughter of a hotel keeper at Waterloo, Flora Eliza Brooks, but she fell pregnant. He decided to carry out the abortion himself. The young woman became very ill following the procedure, and the irate father of the girl threatened to shoot Cream if he didn't marry her. This he did, but the day after the wedding he hightailed it to Quebec, deserting his new wife. That same year, he turned up in London and began studying medicine at St Thomas's Hospital. Meanwhile, back in Canada, his wife contracted bronchitis and died of what was thought to be consumption. The doctor, however, couldn't help but wonder if the medicine Cream had been sending his wife from England had had something to do with her demise. In 1877, he sat an exam so he could enter the Royal College of Surgeons, but failed. In April 1878, it was believed he gained entry to the Royal College of Physicians and the licentiate of the RCP at the University of Edinburgh, before returning to Canada that May. In May 1879, the body of a girl was found at his premises in Ontario in suspicious circumstances, which damaged his reputation, and his business began to fail. He left for Chicago, but here again he found himself in trouble. He performed an operation on Julia Faulkner, although some sources refer to her as Mary Ann, in 1880, which resulted in her death, and he was arrested, but later acquitted due to lack of evidence. In December that year, one of his patients, Ellen Stack, died from a prescription Cream had written for her. He put the blame squarely on the pharmacist and tried to blackmail him. The pharmacist handed over the letters to the police, but no charges were brought against Cream. In October 1881, he was convicted of the murder of Daniel Stott. Cream was having an affair with Stott's wife, Julia, and the two conspired to kill Stott by poisoning him with strychnine. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in the Illinois State Penitentiary, but served 10 years and was released. Using his inheritance money from his late father, William, he returned to London in early October 1891. He found lodgings at the Anderton Hotel in Fleet Street before finding permanent lodgings at Lambeth Palace Road, and on 6 October he met Elizabeth Masters at Piccadilly Circus. He accompanied her to her lodgings in Hercules Road, then took her to a music hall. They then met one of her friends, Elizabeth Day. Cream set up a date with her, which Masters told her friend Day about, as she was so excited. They sat by the window waiting for him, but he never appeared. Instead, he'd met his first victim. He'd accidentally bumped into Matilda Clover, a 27-year-old prostitute, and accompanied her home. Masters and Day followed him. Around a fortnight later, Clover received a letter at her Lambeth Road home to meet Cream outside the Canterbury Music Hall. Later that evening, she was seen in the company of a man fitting the description of Cream, and they entered her home. An hour or so passed, and he left. Then the girl left, returning later, seemingly drunk. She was alone and went straight to bed. Half an hour later, her screams were heard by the lodging-house servant. She rushed up to help the girl, who was writhing about, although had managed to get her head stuck between the bed and the wall. The writhing and screaming continued, and only stopped briefly when she was exhausted. She asked to kiss her 2-year-old child, so the servant brought the child to her. This went on for 6 hours. The doctor arrived at 7 o'clock in the morning, but having been told by the landlady she'd been drinking heavily the night before, he treated her accordingly. At the trial, he admitted she was in a critical condition, and when called for an hour later, had referred her to another doctor who failed to appear. She died soon afterwards, and was buried in a pauper's grave a few days later. The death certificate cited her drinking as the cause of her death. A few days later, Cream asked his landlady's daughter about the girl who died in Lambeth Road. Sometime afterwards, he wrote a letter to Dr. Broadbent, an eminent physician, accusing him of murdering her with strychnine, and tried to blackmail and extort money from him. This led to his partial downfall, as the only person who could possibly have known she was poisoned was the poisoner himself. Broadbent took the letter to the police, but nothing was done. In early January 1892, Cream paid a flying visit to Canada, having become engaged to a young woman called Laura Sabatini. In April he returned to London, and soon after the city was captivated by the story of a further 2 deaths from strychnine poisoning. Both 21-year-old Alice Marsh and 18-year-old Emma Shrivell had been prostitutes that Cream had written to. As they were suspiciously similar to the death of the 19-year-old prostitute Ellen Donworth, this raised enough suspicion about the death of Clover to have her body exhumed. It was found that, like Marsh, Shrivell and Donworth, she too had succumbed to strychnine poisoning. The net was closing in on Cream. He'd openly bought capsules. He'd associated with these women, and he tried to force a woman called Louisa Harvey to take 2 pills, but she was suspicious, so didn't swallow them. There was also his letters accusing innocent people of the poisonings, and he had an intimate knowledge and interest when news of the girls' deaths had been made public. He also boasted about his association with prostitutes. The officer in charge of the Lambeth poisoner investigation was Inspector John Bennett Tunbridge. He was smart, methodical and thorough. Every scrap of evidence was looked at, and soon he had Cream in his sights. The pair met after Cream made a complaint through his solicitors, Waters and Bryan, that he was being followed and had been interviewed several times by the police, and it was becoming harassment. Robert Anderson, the Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, used Cream's complaint to have him questioned once more. Tunbridge arrived at Cream's lodgings on 29th May at around 11 o'clock in the morning, on the pretext of the complaint. He tried to steer the discussion towards the poisonings, but Cream refused to be drawn, so Tunbridge left it. However, Cream went on to show him a bottle of pills from his sample case. The label showed these contained a small amount of strychnine. When Tunbridge left, about an hour later, his mind was made up. He'd found the Lambeth poisoner. Cream was originally arrested on a charge of blackmail before the rest of the evidence fell into place, and he was formally charged with the London murders on 13th July 1892. At his trial at the Old Bailey, which began on 17th October and lasted 5 days, Cream's defence was that the prosecution had failed to connect all the evidence in the chain of events that resulted in these women's deaths. Cream was confident that he would be acquitted of all charges, right up until a day or two before the end of the trial. But the judge, in his summing up, told him to be prepared for the inevitable verdict. On hearing this, his bravado and confidence melted away, with his anxiety clearly visible to the jury. Cream was found guilty of the murders. The judge described his crimes as cold-blooded cruelty and of unparalleled atrocity. There was little public sympathy for Cream. The night before he was due to be hanged was spent restlessly, while he was closely guarded constantly. He was woken at 6 o'clock in the morning and ate a light breakfast. The prison chaplain, the Reverend George Merrick, then visited him to offer some comfort, and at 9:15, the Governor, Lieutenant Colonel Everard Millman, the Under-Sheriff, Frederick Metcalfe, and James Billington, the hangman, visited the condemned man's cell. He was then led to the pinioning room, where he was bound with leather thongs. He was quiet and did all that was asked of him. Then, led by the chief warder, Scott, and followed by the chaplain, hangman, governor, and police surgeon Dr. Gilbert, Cream made his way to the scaffold. He never said a word and was hanged. In his will, dated 23rd December 1891, Cream had left everything to his fiancée, Laura Sabatini. He stated that she had brought him happiness he'd not known before. It had been witnessed on the 7th of January 1892. However, the day before he was hanged, he revoked this will in his prison cell and left his estate to his solicitors as compensation for the expenses they'd incurred during their defence of him. Percy Lefroy Mapleton was born in February 1860 in Peckham in London. His father was a naval officer, but his mother was a sickly woman and died when he was 6 years old. Unable to care for his son due to his heavy drinking, his father passed him to an aunt who brought him up. Like his mother, he too was a sickly boy, and his aunt spoiled him. On leaving school, he wanted to study law, but he failed to get on the course he wanted. In 1878, he posed as a theatrical agent and conned numerous actors into signing contract for a comedy, which he said was going to tour theatres under the name of John Howden. Of course, he disappeared with their money and was never seen again. It was his ambition to be a writer, but the lifestyle and constant rejection resulted in failure. On Monday, 27th June 1881, Mapleton decided to take the train from London Bridge down to Brighton, a journey that took 90 minutes. He boarded the afternoon down train and, making his way through the first-class carriage, chose a compartment occupied by Frederick Isaac Gould. In his early 60s, Gould was a frequent traveller between his home at Preston Village near Brighton and the English capital. He owned a chain of bakery shops in London, and he and his wife Lydia lived in the East End before his retirement and buying a house at Claremont Terrace in Preston Village. Over time, he sold many of his shops, although retained one or two of them, and this was his reason for heading into London to check up on them. On this day, he'd visited his bakery in a shop on East Street in Walworth, in order to collect its takings, amounting to £33 in gold and 5 shillings. Gould always tried to find a first-class compartment that was empty, as he wasn't keen on strangers. He would then remove his hat, place a skull cap on his head, and if anyone entered, would pretend to be asleep. When the train arrived at Preston Park, the passengers alighted from it and handed over their tickets to the ticket collector. When the collector, Joseph Stark, opened the door of the first-class compartment, he saw a tall, young man, Mapleton, covered in blood, and his collar and tie were missing. The young man told the collector he'd been attacked, shot at 3 times, and struck on the head with a pistol. Gould, meanwhile, was nowhere to be seen. Stark helped Mapleton onto the platform, and when he asked his name, gave it as Arthur Lefroy, as he was settled into the ticket office. Here was also the station superintendent, Henry Anscombe. But something didn't sit quite right with Stark. For one thing, there was no one else in the compartment, and he noted a gold watch hanging out of his shoe. Police interviewed Mapleton at Brighton, but his recollection of what happened was vague. What he did tell them, though, was that he was attacked by a gentleman on the train as it went through a tunnel, and he'd fought back. Police, however, had also noticed the gold watch and chain in his shoe, and when questioned, Mapleton told them it belonged to him. He tried to say that either his assailant had placed it there during the scuffle, or he himself had placed it there in a half-conscious state to protect his valuables. He also told them he was a journalist and had gone to interview Mrs. Nye Chart, the owner of the Theatre Royal. He went on that there were two men in the carriage, one aged around 50 and the other older. After they'd passed Croydon, he said he'd fallen asleep only to wake up in the bloodied carriage and having been robbed of 20 shillings. Mapleton's injuries were superficial, but attended to at the county hospital in Brighton. He was then escorted back to London on the Up train by Detective Sergeant George Holmes, who was tasked with making sure he was okay. They stopped off for him to buy a new collar. Meanwhile, Gould's body had been discovered at Balcombe Tunnel by two plate layers, Thomas Jennings and his nephew Tom Jennings, where he'd been thrown out of the moving train. At first they thought it was a pile of clothes, but soon realised it was a body. His throat had been cut, and the body had been severely damaged from being pushed from a fast-moving train. A telegram was sent to Detective Sergeant Holmes, but it failed to reach the officer in time. Gould's body was removed to the Railway Inn in Balcombe. A doctor was called and examined him, and he was pronounced dead. When Holmes and Mapleton arrived at Croydon, a telegram was waiting for Holmes regarding the gold watch and its serial number. Mapleton got the number wrong, but made an excuse, saying the events had upset him. Holmes accompanied Mapleton to an address in Wallington in Surrey, where he waited outside as the man changed his clothes, but Mapleton gave him the slip and disappeared. Another telegram was waiting for Holmes, informing him of the dead man, that he had no watch, and had been the victim of a vicious murder. By the time he received the news, Mapleton was the prime suspect in the case. The first-class carriage was moved to a siding for inspection and was found to have bullet holes in the seat cushions and panelling, and blood was found in various places, including on a handkerchief and a discarded newspaper. Lydia Gould was informed later that night about the fate of her husband. On Wednesday, 29th June, the East Sussex coroner, Wynne Baxter, opened an inquest into the death, and the verdict returned was wilful murder at the hands of Mapleton. A post-mortem examination was carried out on Friday 1st July, and Dr. Thomas Bond found a bullet mark under Gould's ear in his neck, but it didn't kill him, rather just stunned him, and that bullet was extracted from his spine. He'd been slashed around 14 times, but was found to have been alive when thrown from the train. He'd suffered a fractured skull, although the doctor believed this had happened post-mortem. His cause of death was syncope, or a brief loss of consciousness coming from shock and blood loss. He also didn't believe it was a man who'd simply walked onto the track, but believed it was murder. An investigation got underway swiftly, with a description of Mapleton appearing in newspapers. The Daily Telegraph even went so far as to publish a composite drawing of the wanted man, the first time this had happened in the history of crime. Mrs. Chart was tracked down and interviewed by officers. She informed them she had no appointments with Mapleton and had never met him. Knowing he was a wanted man, Mapleton managed to evade the police for a short time. He rented a room at Mrs. Vickers' house at 32 Smith Street in Stepney, East London, registering under the name of Clark. A cousin, Francis Seal, received a telegram asking for his wages to be sent there, so Seal informed the police of his whereabouts. The net was closing in. Gold's wife also made public the serial number on the gold watch and the name of its maker. This made it impossible for Mapleton to pawn it, and it was known Gold had no other items of any great value on him. When Inspector Donald Sutherland Swanson of the Metropolitan Police and his team of police officers found him on Friday 8th July, Mapleton was ill and half-starved. Bloodied clothes were found in his room, and the police already knew he'd pawned the revolver used in the murder. Mapleton stood trial at Maidstone in Kent before John Coleridge, Lord Chief Justice Coleridge, on Friday 4th November 1881. The prosecution case was led by the Attorney General Henry James, while Mapleton was defended by Montague Williams. In just 10 minutes, he was found guilty of murdering Frederick Gold by the jury and sentenced to death. The 21-year-old was hanged on 29th November at Lewes Prison by William Marwood, still maintaining his innocence. 25-year-old Constable George Samuel Cook of Bow Street Police Station was a well-respected Metropolitan Police officer in Victorian London. He was attached to E Division, which covered the area of Holborn, but things were to turn sour after he met sex worker Maud Merton. Maud was 18 years old and worked the area around the Strand's Theatre, although she was new to the area, having arrived just 4 weeks earlier, in May 1891. The following month, Police Constable Cook was walking the streets and came across Maud. They struck up a conversation, and shortly afterwards, Cook moved into her Lambeth home, where she told the other lodgers that her new boyfriend was a waiter. After a short time, she began using the term Mrs. Cook. It was known that being a police officer meant that thorough checks were carried out, but not where members of the force lived or who they lived with. It was all to do with keeping the perception that they were respectable, even in their private lives. Cook knew his senior officers would take a very dim view of him and where he was now living, so kept the information to himself. Over the next 2 years, the couple kept the relationship going, but in April 1893, Maud visited the Bow Street station and made a complaint about Cook, telling the officers that he was harassing her and that it had to stop. She was led into a room and a statement was taken by Inspector George Wood, who said he would deal with the complaint. He then interviewed Cook for his side of the story. He told him he did indeed know Maud and visited her lodgings on occasion, but told Wood that they were not together as a couple and that he was not living with her at Lambeth. He went on to tell the inspector that he was seeing another young woman who he intended to marry, but that Maud was obsessed with destroying his relationship with his new girl. Wood decided he had no choice but to suspend him, pending an inquiry by the Assistant Commissioner. Just a week later, Cook was reinstated and transferred to another police station. This was Nottingdale in X Division, Kilburn. Maud discovered where he'd been transferred to and on 6 June 1893 entered the police office. Constable Rosewarne was on the front desk. He later testified that the young woman had asked if Cook was working that day. He told her he wasn't on duty until that evening, when he was to patrol around Wormwood Scrubs prison. He later identified her as the young woman who'd been murdered. At 10:10 that night, Constable Joseph Harris was patrolling around the North Pole public house near the prison when he passed a constable. This stuck in his mind, as it was usual for there to be 2 constables on the beat, not just one, but he moved on and never thought any more about it. A few minutes later, a young woman, Maud as it turned out, ran into him and asked if he knew Cook, but he replied he didn't know him personally, but had just passed him while doing the rounds. He pointed out the direction of where the officer had been, and the young woman went on her way. It transpired Cook's partner that night, Constable Alvin Kemp, had been delayed back at the Bow Street station as he had a report to complete before heading out on the beat with his new colleague. He'd arranged to meet Cook later that evening, once he was done. Meanwhile, Maud had found Cook. They were witnessed arguing by a passer-by, Thomas Grimshaw, who worked as a chemist at the prison. He was heading home, and the couple were shouting at one another outside his house. As he passed, he said, "Good evening," to the pair, and the officer replied, "Good evening," before the argument continued, but in hushed tones. Grimshaw entered his home and made his way to the kitchen, where he heard the pair still arguing. Suddenly, it went quiet. A short time later, Kemp appeared outside Grimshaw's home, and the 2 constables went on their way. Kemp later described Cook as being jolly and jovial as they did their patrol. On the morning of 7th June at around 5 o'clock, a local shepherd, Henry William Kimberley, who kept sheep on the land near to the prison, made a grim discovery. It was the body of a young woman, her face covered in blood, and she had signs that she'd been struck with something heavy, as half her face was badly damaged. He immediately informed the authorities. Police surgeon Robert Jackson examined the body in situ and concluded that the young woman had died from a severe blow to the head that caused 2 fractures to her skull and bleeding to the brain. He said that she'd been either kicked or hit with a blunt object, and that had caused her death. It was Maud Merton. On the same day the body was found, Kate Robinson, wife of police officer David Robinson and landlady to Cook at Silchester Road in Notting Hill, noticed her lodger scraping at the ground in the garden. After he left, and her curiosity piqued, she went for a look and discovered the handle of a police truncheon and a police officer's whistle. Following her discovery, she told her husband, and that set off a chain of events that would see Cook in the dock. At the house, the police found incriminating evidence to supplement the garden finds. A pair of bloody trousers with blood between the bottom and the knee of the left side and blood spatter on boots, both of which belonged to Cook, were taken in evidence, and Cook was arrested. At the trial, it transpired that the police officer had continued to see Maud on a regular basis. As he stood in the dock, he sometimes smiled at officers he recognised. On 8 July 1893, George Cook was convicted of the murder of Maud Merton and sentenced to death. However, the 18 jury members couldn't agree on whether it was murder or manslaughter, so the verdict they gave was wilful murder under a great provocation. An appeal for clemency was launched, but failed. He was hanged at Newgate Prison on Tuesday, 25th July, 1893. He was 27. Up until the murder of 33-year-old Sarah Everard by Wayne Couzens in London in March 2021, Cook had been the only serving British police officer to be charged with, and found guilty of, murder.